The autumn wind pressed cold against the ridge, slipping through the gaps in the shutters of Daniel Harker's small cabin, as if it had somewhere urgent to be. He leaned against the splintered wooden frame of his porch, cigarette smoke curling around him, and stared up at the sky. The stars were out tonight, brighter than he'd seen in years, yet something hung among them, a faint, trembling glow that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was one of the migratory lights the townsfolk whispered about. Will-o'-the-wisp, they called it. But this wasn't drifting. It pulsed. It moved, deliberate, precise, almost like it was searching. He hadn't left the ridge much these past weeks. Mostly he kept to himself. The old stories about Point Pleasant's visitors were supposed to be children's tales, drunk talk around the general store. But the ridge had been quiet for decades, until now. That morning, he had found the first sign, a deer mutilated in the clearing below his cabin. No blood on the frost, only strange, clean cuts along its flanks. Coyotes didn't work like this. Humans didn't work like this either. The sheriff had shrugged when he called. "Probably another bobcat," he said. But Daniel knew the cuts had been surgical, deliberate. He sat at the kitchen table that evening, shaking hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The ridge's stillness pressed against him, heavy and alive. The mutilated deer wasn't the first anomaly. A few nights ago, the neighbor's sheep had been found similarly torn apart, perfectly arranged. No tracks led away from the clearing, no signs of struggle. Daniel had walked the ridge at dawn and found nothing, only the clean precision of intelligence at work. He remembered the childhood stories of strange lights over the mountains, of people vanishing, of shimmering shapes glimpsed at the edge of vision. He had laughed at them once. Now those tales seemed less like superstition and more like warnings. Something had come, and it had chosen the ridge. He might be next. By nightfall, Daniel's fear had become a gnawing certainty. From his kitchen window, he saw a shimmer in the trees. He froze. At first, it was only a movement in the shadows, but then a figure materialized at the edge of the clearing. Its thin body was pale, impossibly long-limbed, its head too large for its frame, and then it pressed against the cabin window. Daniel stumbled back as its black eyes met his, unblinking. He could see the delicate contours of its face, the ridges of bone beneath pale, stretched skin, the faint curve of its thin fingers pressed against the glass. It was studying him. Not with malice. There was no emotion he could recognize. Only awareness, intelligence, the patient calculation of a hunter. He wanted to scream, to run, to hide, but his body refused. The thing on the other side of the glass didn't move. It only stared, its breath leaving no fog, its expression unreadable. He could see himself reflected faintly in those eyes, small, trembling animal. And then, slowly, the figure leaned closer. Its skin brushed the glass with a faint squeak that turned Daniel's stomach. He stumbled backward, knocking over the chair behind him. The sound must have broken something in the moment, because the figure flinched or twitched, and then glided backward into the dark without a sound. He stayed there on the kitchen floor, heart hammering against his ribs, listening to the silence press in from all sides. Every board creak, every gust of wind felt wrong, deliberate. He didn't move for hours. When dawn finally seeped into the room, Daniel found himself still on the floor, half frozen, staring at the empty window. There was a faint outline on the glass, condensation where it had leaned. He rubbed it away, but it smeared instead, streaking across the pane like a bruise. He didn't decide to investigate that morning. It was more like he couldn't stand the thought of sitting still. Every instinct screamed to leave the ridge, to drive down to town, to get as far away as possible. But when he reached for his keys, he found the truck wouldn't start. The engine turned once, coughed, then nothing. He tried again. Dead. So instead, he walked the perimeter of his land, not out of courage, but from a frantic need to prove he was still in control of something. Anything. The trees whispered. The frost cracked under his boots too loudly. The world felt thinner, and then he saw movement. Just a flicker at first. A shape where there shouldn't be one. Then another. 3 of them, watching from the tree line. Days bled into one another. Daniel barely left the cabin, rationing food and water with a desperation that made each moment feel unbearably long. The ridge, which had once been comforting in its quiet solitude, now felt like a cage, each tree and shadow conspiring to remind him he was prey. The mutilations escalated. One morning, he discovered a raccoon at the edge of the clearing, its body arranged with deliberate care, eyes staring skyward in a way that seemed to mock him. Panic gripped him as he stumbled back, almost dropping his camera in the frost. He had wanted evidence, yes, but now that he had it, it only confirmed the inescapable truth. He was being watched, studied, hunted. The figures appeared more frequently, small, pale shapes that glided through the trees with impossible silence, emerging at the edge of vision and vanishing before he could blink. One night, Daniel saw them closer than ever. The frost on the ground glimmered with their passage, bending and twisting unnaturally beneath their weight. Shadows warped around them, making the forest itself seem complicit in the hunt. Inside the cabin, the intrusion became impossible to ignore. He had barricaded doors and windows as best he could, yet he woke one morning to find his papers scattered, books opened and inspected, even his photographs rearranged. Nothing was stolen. Everything was examined, cataloged, as though the Greys were measuring him, learning who he was. Daniel's hands shook as he swept the cabin, checking every corner, every shelf, but found no trace of their presence beyond the careful disorder. Sleep became a battleground. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made him flinch. Shadows twisted against the walls, and sometimes he could swear he saw movement in the corner of his eye. A thin arm, a glimmer of pale skin. He began to leave lights on, then turn them off, pacing from one end of the cabin to the other, convinced they were watching, noting his patterns, studying his reactions. Once, he glimpsed one pressed against a window, watching him silently from the outside. Its black eyes reflected nothing, yet they carried an intelligence that unsettled him deeper than any fear he had known. He froze in place, unable to move, feeling the weight of a gaze that pierced through his mind. And then it glided backward into the night, leaving only the cold ridge and his own racing heartbeat. He tried to rationalize, to convince himself that it was a trick of light, a shadow or exhaustion. But the ridge offered no comfort. Even during the day, he felt their presence, a quiet insistence shaping his surroundings. Frost crunched too loudly under his boots. Tree branches bent unnaturally. Shadows lengthened with impossible intent. Daniel began to map the ridges obsessively, memorizing every clearing, every depression in the ground. He tried to anticipate the figure's movements, to create a route of escape that might save him. But each time he followed a path he thought safe, he found new signs. Footprints that weren't his, glimpses of movement at impossible angles, the occasional shimmer of light in the corner of his vision. One night, desperation drove him to the edge of the tree line, flashlight trembling in his hands. There, between frost-laden trees, he saw 3 of them standing perfectly still, staring. He counted their heads, their elongated limbs, their impossibly black eyes, and realized the numbers had grown. They were not just watching, they were coordinating, they were calculating. The air felt heavier as he backed away, but the ridge itself seemed to warp around him. Paths that should have led down the slope twisted unexpectedly. Trees that should have offered cover now loomed like walls. Every instinct screamed that he was being funneled, herded, corralled towards some inevitable conclusion he couldn't yet see. Inside the cabin, the intrusions grew bolder. Books were shifted to the floor, drawers left open, a cup of coffee knocked to spill across the counter. Daniel had been awake all night, pacing, listening, and yet he hadn't heard a sound. The figures had entered silently, moved deliberately, and left no trace beyond their careful rearrangement. They were patient, they were intelligent, and he was utterly exposed. His dreams became their hunting ground. He would wake gasping, sure that the figures were standing at the foot of his bed, staring. When he reached for the shotgun, his hands shook too violently to aim. Shadows in the cabin shifted unnaturally, twisting, stretching. Even his own reflection in the cracked window looked wrong, elongated, thinner, his eyes hollow, and yet he could not flee. Each time he attempted to descend the ridge to the truck, the engine refused to start. Each path that might lead to help seemed blocked or warped. The Greys had made the ridge their hunting ground, and he had no choice but to follow its rules, walking ever closer to the inevitable. By now, sleep deprivation, fear, and constant vigilance had begun to erode his mind. He talked aloud to himself, rehearsing escape routes that didn't exist, recounting the mutilations, tracing patterns in the frost, trying to find a logic that might save him. But every analysis, every plan, returned the same conclusion. He was marked, and the hunt would not end until they claimed him. Daniel didn't remember the last time he'd slept. Days, maybe weeks, had dissolved into one continuous panic, one endless loop of shadows and movement, of eyes that watched and calculated. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a stage, each plank and rafter arranged by unseen hands, to remind him that every inch was observed. He sat huddled in the corner, shotgun across his lap, knees pulled tight to his chest. The stove was cold. His coffee had grown bitter and thick from neglect. Every creak of the floorboards made him flinch, his pulse hammering like a drum in his skull. He knew it was foolish. He had seen them, measured them, counted them, and still, he couldn't move. Then he saw it, the thin, pale form at the edge of the kitchen doorway. Its black eyes were unblinking, wider than they should have been, absorbing him like a prism sucks in light. It didn't glide, didn't flicker. It simply stood there, impassive, as though the cabin itself belonged to it. Daniel tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. His mind jumped desperately for any thought, any rationalization. Maybe it was a shadow, maybe a trick of the light, but it was too solid, too real, too present. The creature leaned its head slightly, tilting it with unnerving patience. Daniel felt the weight of its attention pressing against him, the quiet calculation of a predator that had no concept of malice because it did not need malice. It was interest without concern, observation without empathy. And that was worse than any blade, any bite. Daniel backed against the wall, the shotgun shaking in his hands. The gray followed, gliding closer with perfect, deliberate silence. Its limbs, impossibly long and thin, bent in ways no human body could, reaching around furniture, slipping over obstacles, always nearer, always observing. He stumbled into the table, knocking over papers, photographs, and an old mug. The mug shattered, scattering ceramic shards across the floor. The gray's head tilted again. Its fingers, delicate as glass, hovered over the shards without touching them, as if noting the arrangement. Daniel's throat constricted, a scream forming, breaking into a sob. Then the window caught his attention. Another figure pressed its head against the glass, inches from his face. No sound, no expression. Just a black-eyed stare, endless and fathomless. Daniel's reflection stared back, hollow and alien, his face pale, lips cracked, eyes wide with uncomprehending terror. He wanted to run, to leap, to vanish. But every part of him knew there was nowhere to go. The cabin had contracted around him. The corners seemed sharper, the shadows deeper, the floorboards rising imperceptibly to meet his boots. He could feel the presence of the grays in every inch of space, in every breath of air, in every pulse of his own blood. And still, they did not strike, did not speak, did not touch him in conventional terms. Their indifference was total, absolute, suffocating. Daniel sank to the floor, pressing his back against the wall, knees trembling. One of the grays drifted toward him, sliding between him and the kitchen door. Its head tilted, the thin neck bending at an angle no human could achieve, and it lingered over him. A finger hovered near his hand, not touching, just there. The precision of its movement, the silence of its observation, was more terrifying than any act of violence. He whispered, barely audible, "Please, just let me be." The figure didn't move. It didn't blink. Its black eyes simply measured him. Outside, through the frost glass window, more figures had gathered. The ridge itself shimmered unnaturally. Trees bending, shadows pooling, paths twisting. He tried to track them, to map a way out, but the land was no longer land. It was an extension of their perception, a stage built for the hunt, and he was the only actor. The realization struck him like a blow. He was not being chased. He was being studied, and the study was clinical, indifferent, and infinite. Daniel barely moved. He crouched in the corner of the cabin, eyes fixed on the floor, hands trembling around the shotgun, his every breath shallow, ragged. The grays were everywhere now, though he couldn't always see them. Their presence was in the space itself, pressing in, filling the air, bending the familiar angles of the room, making every shadow twitch. He hadn't slept in days. His stomach had shriveled, his muscles ached from tension, his mind a raw, looping tape of dread. Yet he couldn't leave. The truck still refused to start. The paths down the ridge were warped, twisted beyond recognition. Even the forest itself had become untrustworthy, a living maze that seemed to respond to him, guiding him deeper into the hunt. Then it happened. A drawer in the kitchen slid open with a soft hiss, though no hand touched it. Daniel's eyes widened. His papers rustled. He froze mid-breath as the drawer closed again with surgical precision. He swallowed hard, trying to calm himself, trying to convince himself it was wind, a trick of the cabin settling. But the subtle scraping of something moving, the gentle shift of books on a shelf, a paper nudged slightly askew, told him otherwise. He dared a glance to the corner. A gray crouched there, pale, thin, impossibly still. Its head tilted slightly, the classic bulbous shape outlined against the dim light. Its long, slender fingers reached toward a stack of his letters, sifting them delicately, unfolding one after another. Daniel's chest constricted. The creature wasn't searching for anything. It was cataloging, absorbing the minutiae of his life with precise, alien patience. He whispered, barely audibly, "Please, go away." The gray did not move. It did not blink. It did not acknowledge him. Its black eyes held only the eternal, unflinching calculation of a being that did not need to speak, to dominate, to terrify, to exist inside your mind. Daniel shook violently, backing toward the stove. Another gray emerged silently at the window, pressing its face inches from the glass. He could see every ridge of its pale skin, the delicate contours of its impossible head, the abyss of its eyes. He felt as though it had crawled inside his skull, measuring the way he breathed, the irregularity of his heartbeat. And yet, no harm was done. No physical attack. But the cabin itself had become a prison of terror. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching along the walls like viscous liquid. Frost on the window bent slightly toward the intruder, forming subtle arcs that seemed almost deliberate, as though the very ridge itself had taken sides. Daniel's mind spun. The world was no longer composed of normal dimensions. There were angles he could not comprehend, paths that looped impossibly, spaces that refused to obey logic. He stumbled into the corner, knees scraping against splintered wood. Another gray hovered just above the ceiling, suspended impossibly, head tilting down toward him. One drifted behind him, sliding across the floor in a manner that defied any human gait. Daniel's senses collapsed into a single, overwhelming awareness. He was being observed from every angle, inside and out, by beings that could exist anywhere at once, and that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or frightened. He tried to speak again. I won't fight. I won't run. Just, please." The gray at the window remained impassive, its eyes black, endless, absorbing him. The one behind him leaned closer, a finger hovering over his shoulder, not touching, but close enough to make him recoil in terror. The creature above him moved its head in perfect synchronization with the others, studying him. Not angry, not curious, not compassionate, only calculating. Daniel realized something impossible. They were everywhere, even in spaces that should have been impossible to occupy. The cabin, the ridge, the tree line, all were extensions of their awareness. He could not hide. He could not escape. Every instinct screamed flight. Every rational thought whispered futility. He screamed once, the sound tearing from his throat raw and ragged. The creatures did not flinch. They did not react. Their indifference, total and absolute, gnawed at his mind, more terrifying than claws or teeth. He wanted to vomit. He wanted to smash the shotgun over their heads. He wanted to disappear. But no human action could alter the calculus that had marked him. And then the first one touched him. Not physically, not in the conventional sense. Its presence brushed along the back of his neck, so subtle he barely felt it, yet it altered the air around him, the perception of himself, the perception of space. The walls seemed closer, the floor seemed to rise. Frost shimmered unnaturally along the edges of the cabin. He understood, with gut-wrenching clarity, that they could bend perception, fold dimensions, intrude upon reality itself. Daniel collapsed, head in his hands, tears streaking his frozen cheeks. The world was no longer human. He was no longer human. Everything he had known about life, space, and safety had been invalidated by their presence. And still, they watched. Outside, through the warped window, more figures pressed their faces to the glass. One slid a finger across the frost, leaving an intricate, perfect line. Daniel stared at it, seeing not just the mark, but the intelligence behind it. The deliberate patience of a being that had all the time in the world to examine every detail of a single human life. He whispered, finally realizing the truth. "You don't care." They did not. The ridge had become a labyrinth of impossibility. Each step Daniel took inside the cabin, each attempt to flee, to run down the slope, to reach the truck, led him into a world that no longer obeyed human logic. The floor tilted subtly beneath him. Boards creaked in ways that betrayed no cause. Shadows deepened and shifted at impossible angles. He realized with paralyzing clarity that the grays were not limited to space as he understood it. The cabin, the ridge, the forest, all were extensions of their will, bending, folding, reshaping reality itself. They came closer now. Every corner of the cabin was occupied, yet he could see only fragments at a time. A hand brushing a countertop, a pale head in the window frame, the impossibly black eyes floating above him. He could feel their attention pressing against his skull, measuring the irregularities of his heartbeat, the tremor of his breath, the wavering of his gaze. Every instinct screamed flight. Every rational thought whispered futility. Daniel stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug, arms flailing, and one of them glided toward him with impossible precision, long fingers hovering near his temple, close enough that the air felt thicker, heavier. He flinched violently, shrieking, but the creature did not respond. It did not recoil. It did not blink. Its mere presence, impartial and unyielding, was more terrifying than any attack, more painful than any wound. He retreated to the corner again, pressing himself against the wall, lungs burning, mind fraying. The others had multiplied, or perhaps he had simply begun to notice them all at once. Figures drifted along the walls, hovered above the ceiling, pressed faces to every window, their fingers leaving intricate, impossible patterns in the frost. His own reflection in the glass was wrong, stretched, hollowed, eyes too wide, lips thin and cracked. He didn't recognize himself anymore. And then he realized they were not hunting him in the conventional sense. They were not angry. They were not curious in the human way. They were measuring, cataloging, assessing, indifferent to terror, indifferent to life. That indifference, absolute and complete, gnawed at his mind. Fear was irrelevant. Pain was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the observation, and the observation was infinite. Objects shifted around him. A chair he had set firmly against the wall now stood in the middle of the room. Papers he had stacked neatly lay splayed across the floor. His rifle, once across his lap, now leaned against the stove. Every movement he had made was undone, replaced by their subtle rearrangements, demonstrating a mastery of the cabin that made him feel naked and exposed. He screamed, pounding the floor with fists, but sound carried no weight here. The Greys did not flinch, did not react, did not even acknowledge the noise. One hovered inches above him, head tilted in that impossibly alien way, eyes unblinking, black, vast. Another leaned against the far window, watching. The air itself seemed to pulse with their presence. He realized, finally, that he could not escape. Every plan, every idea, every instinct had been anticipated. He was trapped in their perception, folded into their observation, a specimen of terror catalogued without compassion. His body shivered violently. He felt them in his mind, not thoughts, not voices, but pressure, calculation, presence. They understood his panic, his despair, his fleeting hope, and they were indifferent. There was no cruelty in their actions. There was only complete, absolute detachment, and that detachment was worse than any violence he could imagine. Time fractured. He lost the ability to measure it. Days, nights, hours, all bled together into a continuous haze of fear. He would wake, find the cabin subtly altered, objects moved, shadows deeper, frost on the windows forming strange geometric shapes. Each time he blinked, the world shifted imperceptibly, making him wonder if he had moved at all, or if they had moved him. And then one came closer. It slid along the wall with the silent grace of water, pausing just inches from his trembling hand. Its long, delicate fingers hovered over the edge of the countertop. Daniel flinched. The tip of one finger brushed against the wood near his hand, not touching him directly, but close enough that the air itself seemed to warp. He could feel the presence as a physical weight pressing into his mind. He stumbled backward, tripping into the chair, then the table. Another figure appeared above the ceiling beam, its head bending impossibly down to study him. The shadows cast were wrong, bending at angles that made him dizzy, making him nauseous. Every corner of the room was occupied by presence he could not escape, yet he saw nothing fully, could not comprehend the scope of their numbers. He cried out, "Stop! Please, I can't." The words were meaningless. They did not care. They could not care. The final awareness struck him. There would be no rescue, no return. His life was no longer his own. Every memory, every thought, every breath had been observed, catalogued, and deemed irrelevant in the face of their study. There was no malice, no hate, no interest beyond the meticulous measurement of his being. He was, to them, data. He fell to the floor, sobbing, rocking, whispering incoherent pleas. The grays drifted around him, close enough to feel the chill of their skin, their presence brushing the edges of his perception. His body quaked, mind unraveling. The cabin, the ridge, the forest, everything had become an extension of their calculation, a space where he existed only as an object of study. And then, without warning, it happened. The world folded. The cabin stretched impossibly, the ceiling lifting and falling, the walls bending, frost and shadow swirled. The grays closed in, moving with a silence and patience that made him scream until his throat burned raw. He tried to move, to flee, to resist, but every motion was anticipated, folded back upon itself. The air itself pressed against him like a hand. Then there was only the sensation of being lifted, drawn upward, upward, into a space that was not space, observed from every angle, catalogued in ways his mind could not comprehend. Daniel could feel the infinite detachment, the absolute indifference, and in that final, impossibly intimate moment, his terror reached its zenith. He understood, with gut-deep certainty, that this was the end. Not violence, not malice, not anger. Only observation, complete and final. The last thought that flickered through his mind was not fear, not pain, not hope, but the recognition of his own utter, insignificant helplessness. And then he was gone. The cabin remained. Frost on the windows shimmered faintly in the first light of dawn. Shadows lay still. No trace of the man remained. Only the ridge, indifferent and eternal, holding the memory of terror in the cold, unblinking stars above. Daniel's body was trembling so violently, it was almost impossible to distinguish movement from seizure. He huddled in the farthest corner of the cabin, shotgun useless across his lap. Every inch of the room seemed occupied. Shadows warped unnaturally, flickering at the edges of perception. The frost on the windows shimmered with impossible patterns, like the ridge itself was breathing, waiting, responding. He could hear them, or perhaps he could feel them, an oppressive awareness pressing in from every direction. Not footsteps, not whispers, not sounds any human could detect, only presence. It seeped into his mind, brushing against memories, against instinct, against thought itself. He was aware of every movement before it happened, every glide of a limb, every tilt of a head, every deliberate pause and shift. A figure hovered directly above him now, bending impossibly, its black eyes fixed on his own. Another slid along the floor behind him, fingers brushing the ground near his boots, leaving no mark, no trace, only a subtle sense of contact that made his skin crawl. The air itself thickened with their observation. Every breath he drew felt catalogued, every heartbeat measured. Daniel tried to speak. "Please, just leave me." His words dissolved into a stammering whimper. The Greys did not blink, did not shift, did not acknowledge him in any conventional sense. Their indifference was total, absolute, complete. And that indifference was more terrifying than any blow, any bite, any fire. He began to notice more subtle violations. His chair moved while he wasn't looking, leaving him off balance. A book he had used as a placemat now lay open on the counter, pages delicately flipped. A photograph of his younger self stared back at him, then seemed to warp, the face elongating impossibly, reflecting his own terror. He pressed his hands to his eyes, hoping it was a hallucination, but he felt them. The precise, measured presence of beings beyond human comprehension, threading through his space, threading through his mind. One slid its long, impossibly thin hand toward him, not touching, just hovering. Daniel recoiled. The air bent, shifted, thickened, pressing against him like a tide. His heart raced, muscles quivering uncontrollably. He could feel the weight of the ridge pressing down, of the cabin contracting. There was no escape. The walls were no longer walls. They were extensions of observation, stretching and folding according to alien will. He stumbled backward, falling to the floor. Another figure leaned in, face inches from his, its eyes unblinking, impossibly black, infinite. Daniel could feel the calculations, the analysis, the quiet intelligence piercing him without touch, without sound, without malice, only cold study. He screamed again, high-pitched, raw, the sound swallowed immediately by the unnatural thickness of the air. The Greys did not react. One pressed closer at the window, its head cocked to the side in the familiar alien tilt. Another hovered above him, bending impossibly toward the ceiling. Yet another slid behind him, brushing the air near his shoulder with the ghost of a touch. He flinched, shuddered, cried, prayed silently. Nothing mattered. Time fractured entirely. Minutes became seconds. Seconds became hours. Hours became infinite. Daniel could not track it. Could not distinguish the cabin from the forest, the ridge from the air, the shadow from the figures. They were everywhere and nowhere, shaping reality around him, bending perception until the world itself had become a cage of observation. And then, impossibly, finally, they closed in. Not as a group, not as a strike, not violently. They simply surrounded him, around, above, below, pressing close, not touching, yet pressing impossibly, intruding upon every sense, every thought, every flicker of awareness. Daniel curled in on himself, sobbing, shaking, gasping, understanding fully that he was contained entirely within their perception. He whispered one final plea. "Please, I can't. I can't." And the world tilted. The cabin stretched into infinite space. Frosty windows elongated into vertical planes that spiraled into darkness. The walls curved impossibly. Shadows became substance. Figures pressed closer, gliding through the very air, bending reality around him. Every breath, every heartbeat, catalogued, measured, noted. Daniel's mind splintered. He understood then that this was not a hunt in any human sense. He was not prey. He was not a target of anger, fear, or malice. He was an experiment, a specimen, a unit of observation. He felt himself being lifted, drawn into impossible space. The ridge folding, the cabin dissolving. Panic had no purchase. Terror had no edge. Reality itself had become subordinate to the alien logic of their attention. And then he was gone. The cabin remained. Frost glimmered on the windows. The stove sat cold and empty. The shadows lay still. Outside, the ridge waited, patient and indifferent, untouched by time. No trace of Daniel existed, only the lingering impression of terror and the faint, eternal awareness that something had watched, studied, and catalogued him without need for cruelty or malice. Above, the stars hung cold and unblinking, and among them, somewhere, a faint, pulsing light drifted, deliberate, precise, and utterly indifferent.